The Winchester House didn't haunt me, it devoured me. Even now, years later, I feel its presence, a shadow I can't escape. The whispers, faint and insistent, creep into my thoughts when I'm alone, filling the silences with their relentless murmur. They're not sounds you hear, they're thoughts imposed, fragments of something alive, ancient and cruel. I've tried to rationalize it, to label it as stress or an overactive imagination, but deep down I know the truth. It's not just a memory. It's a stain, and it will never wash out. Before I found the house, I thought I knew the rules of the world, solid, unchanging, bound by reason. I believed in facts and logic, in the certainty that every question had an answer if you searched hard enough. I was a journalist by trade, a skeptic by nature, someone who prided themselves on uncovering the truth. But truth is a fragile thing. The Winchester House showed me that, tore it apart piece by piece, and left me with only questions. Questions I'm afraid to ask. It started, as these things often do, with curiosity. I had always been drawn to the unexplainable, urban legends, unsolved mysteries, the thin veil between fact and fiction. Not the easy ones, the kind you could debunk with a quick internet search, but the stories that linger, that defy reason and refuse to be neatly filed away. The Winchester House was one of those mysteries. You've probably heard the broad strokes, a sprawling mansion built by Sarah Winchester, widow of the firearms magnate, in a desperate bid to appease the spirits of those killed by her husband's rifles. Staircases that lead nowhere, doors that open into walls, rooms with no purpose other than to confuse. It's a tourist attraction now, a curiosity for weekend visitors. But that's not the story that drew me in. I stumbled across it late one night, in the dark corners of an old internet forum. Amid the usual chatter, grainy photos of supposed ghosts, half-hearted theories about hauntings, there was a thread titled, "What They Don't Tell You About the Winchester House." The post was short, almost dismissive. It spoke of rooms not shown on the tours, symbols carved into the woodwork, whispers in the walls. The replies were a mix of skepticism and embellishment, until I saw one comment that stopped me cold. I saw it. The shadows move on their own, and if you hear them whisper, it's already too late. I should have scrolled past. But instead, I clicked, and I kept clicking, thread after thread, until I found myself staring at scanned pages from an old journal. The handwriting was hurried, the ink smudged, as if the author had been writing in a panic. The warnings were clear. Do not disturb the sleepers. Do not follow the whispers. The journal was filled with sketches, symbols I didn't recognize, strange markings carved into the wood of the house itself. Notes in the margins spoke of rooms that shifted, of a house that seemed to breathe. And on the final page, scrawled in jagged letters, was a single sentence: "They never left." Something about those words burrowed into me, a splinter I couldn't remove. I told myself it was nonsense, a hoax, the work of someone with too much imagination, but I couldn't let it go. It wasn't just curiosity, it was compulsion. The house had already begun to sink its hooks into me. I booked a tour for the following weekend. The drive to the Winchester House felt like crossing into another world. The fog was thick and clinging, shrouding the landscape in a grey haze. When the house came into view, it seemed to rise out of the mist like a living thing, jagged roof lines cutting into the sky. It didn't look like a house, it looked like a trap. The air was heavy as I stepped out of the car, an almost physical weight pressing down on my chest. I paused, staring at the house, and for a moment I thought I saw movement in one of the windows. Just a flicker, there and gone. My rational mind dismissed it as a trick of the light, but my gut told me otherwise. The tour started like I expected. A cheerful guide led a group of us through the labyrinthine halls, reciting well-worn stories about Sarah Winchester's grief and the bizarre architecture she constructed to confuse spirits. Staircases to nowhere, doors that opened into walls, windows that overlooked nothing but more rooms. It was strange, yes, but it felt safe in its strangeness, like a museum exhibit meant to entertain rather than terrify. But as we moved deeper into the house, that sense of safety began to erode. I noticed the spaces the guide avoided, hallways she skipped without explanation, doors she glanced at too quickly. And then there was the tapping. It was faint, almost imperceptible, coming from behind a plain wooden door at the end of a dim hallway. I lingered as the group moved on, listening. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like a heartbeat. I reached out, my hand hovering over the doorknob, and that's when I felt it, a presence, cold and watchful, just beyond the threshold. Some doors in this house are better left unopened. The guide's voice startled me. She was standing a few feet away, her face pale, her cheerful demeanor gone. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to me, and for a moment I saw something in them I didn't expect. Fear. Real, visceral fear. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the tapping, which stopped the moment I stepped back. But the door didn't feel like a door anymore. It felt like a boundary, a thin barrier between me and something that wanted to be found. When the tour ended, I lingered, pretending to take pictures while I scanned the house for details the guide hadn't mentioned. The longer I stayed, the more I noticed. Faint carvings in the woodwork, symbols like the ones I'd seen in the journal, the way certain hallways seemed darker, their shadows deeper and more impenetrable. As I drove away that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something important, that the house had only shown me what it wanted me to see. I told myself I would return, that I needed more time to explore, to uncover the truth. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about finding answers. The house had hooked me, whispered its invitation, and I was already falling under its spell. This wasn't just a house, it was alive, and it was waiting for me. From the moment I left the Winchester House, I couldn't think about anything else. It was as though the place had lodged itself in my mind, weaving its way into every thought, every quiet moment. I tried to focus on work, to get back to the routine of deadlines and stories, but it was no use. I'd sit at my desk, staring at a blank screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The words wouldn't come. The house had stolen them, just as it had stolen my sleep. I found myself poring over the journal again, its pages spread across my desk like a map I couldn't decipher. The symbols stared back at me, their lines twisting and writhing in ways that made my eyes ache. They weren't just drawings, they felt alive, as though they were watching me. The fragmented warnings, "Do not disturb the sleepers," "Do not follow the whispers," played on a loop in my mind, their meaning just out of reach. Days turned into nights, and nights into something darker. The whispers started then, faint at first, barely more than a murmur. I told myself it was the wind, the hum of the building's pipes, anything but what it truly was. But the whispers didn't stay at the edges. They crept closer, wrapping around my thoughts like a fog. They spoke in tones I couldn't understand, but their intent was clear. They wanted me back. My dreams became something else entirely. I'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. The house's endless corridors stretched out before me in vivid detail. The walls twisted and shifted, the shadows stretched impossibly long, and always, always the whispers. They followed me through the dreamscapes, growing louder with every step, until I woke gasping for air. But even awake, I could feel the house's presence, a weight pressing down on me, suffocating and relentless. I started missing deadlines. My editor stopped calling. Friends, what few I had, began to drift away, their texts unanswered, their invitations ignored. The house had consumed me, and there was nothing left to give anyone else. I delved deeper into the journal, obsessing over its cryptic warnings and frantic sketches. The symbols began to form patterns in my mind, though I couldn't say what they meant. There were notes about Sarah Winchester's séances, about strange lights seen through the windows late at night, and neighbours who reported hearing unnatural sounds. It wasn't just the knocking and tapping of restless spirits, it was chanting, low and guttural, accompanied by the faint glow of symbols carved into the walls. The more I read, the more the lines between history and legend blurred. The house wasn't just a place to confuse spirits, it was something much darker, a labyrinth designed to trap, to contain. But contain what? I couldn't resist. I bought another ticket and returned to the Winchester House, arriving just as the fog rolled in like an invitation. The house loomed larger this time, its jagged roof lines sharper, its countless windows darker. The air was colder, heavier, and I felt the weight of it settle in my chest the moment I stepped through the gates. The tour began the same as before, the guide's cheerful voice reciting well-practiced lines about Sarah's grief and the peculiarities of her endless construction. But the house felt different now. The walls seemed closer, the hallways longer. The shadows didn't just linger, they shifted, their edges too sharp, their movements too deliberate. I stayed at the back of the group, letting the others move ahead while I lingered, watching, listening. I asked the guide about the door from my last visit, the one with the faint tapping. She hesitated, her practiced smile faltering for just a moment before she dismissed it as an old maintenance room. But her voice trembled, just enough for me to notice. When the group turned left at a split in the hallway, I slipped away, heading down an unlit corridor to the right. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows darker. I could hear it again, the faint hum I'd noticed before, but now it was louder, almost rhythmic. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears. It was something you felt deep in your chest, like the distant echo of a heartbeat. At the end of the hallway, I found a door ajar, its paint chipped and peeling. Inside was a small room, its walls lined with shelves covered in thick layers of dust. The air was stale, metallic, and the only object untouched by time was a phonograph in the center of the room. Its brass horn gleamed faintly, out of place in the decay. I approached it cautiously, my breath shallow. The whispers grew louder as I reached for the crank, their tone shifting from faint murmurs to something more insistent. I hesitated, my hand trembling, but curiosity is a sharp blade and I couldn't stop myself from turning the crank. The first notes were warped, discordant, like an old record left in the sun too long. The music wavered, a haunting melody that twisted and bent until it gave way to a voice. Low and guttural, it spoke in a language I didn't understand, the words scraping against my mind like nails on glass. The whispers rose in response, a cacophony of sound that filled the room, pressing against me from all sides. The shadows began to move then, stretching across the walls, their edges too sharp, their forms too deliberate. One by one, they turned toward me, though they had no faces, no eyes. The door behind me slammed shut with a force that rattled the room, and the phonograph needle lifted on its own, the voice falling silent. But the whispers didn't stop. They burrowed deeper, crawling through the back of my mind. I stumbled out of the room, my heart pounding, and rejoined the group as casually as I could manage. The guide's eyes narrowed when she saw me, her gaze lingering as though she knew where I'd been. She didn't say anything, but her silence was worse. The rest of the tour passed in a blur, my mind racing with what I'd seen, what I'd felt. The house wasn't just alive, it was aware. It had noticed me, and I could feel its presence, heavy and watchful, as I stepped outside and back into the fog. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The whispers followed me, faint but constant, a reminder that the house wasn't done with me. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that I'd seen enough. But deep down, I knew better. The Winchester House wasn't just a place. It was a predator, and I was already caught in its web. It started with the bruises. At first, I thought I must have bumped into something in my sleep, but they didn't look like ordinary bruises. They were faint, almost translucent, and shaped like fingerprints. They appeared on my arms, my legs, my back, in places I couldn't possibly have reached on my own. I tried to ignore them, but they kept coming, darker and more distinct each morning. They weren't marks from the world outside. They were marks left by something inside my life, inside me. The whispers were worse now. They didn't just hover at the edges of my awareness, they called my name. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but somehow I knew they were speaking to me. They didn't need words to convey meaning. Their tone was enough. Mocking, accusatory, hungry. I tried to talk to people. I called an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but who always believed in things most people dismissed. I told her about the dreams, the whispers, the house. Her silence on the other end of the line felt heavier than any judgment. When she finally spoke, it was with a forced lightness, as if trying to laugh it off. I could hear the fear in her voice. She didn't believe me, or maybe she did and didn't want to. Either way, the conversation ended with promises to catch up that neither of us meant. I stopped reaching out after that. The house had already started to isolate me, pulling me deeper into its web. The whispers became my only companions, and I hated how familiar they were starting to feel. I returned to the Winchester House for the third time, though I told myself it was just to prove that nothing was happening, that I could walk away if I wanted to. But as I stepped through its gates, I knew that wasn't true. The house had become a part of me, and I wasn't sure where it ended and I began. The house felt different again, though I couldn't say why. The air was colder, the shadows darker, the hallways quieter. It was as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my next move. I wandered away from the group sooner this time, slipping down a narrow corridor that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. The whispers grew louder as I walked, not chaotic now, but deliberate, forming words that were just on the edge of comprehension. At the end of the corridor, I found a door, barely noticeable in the dim light. It wasn't like the others. Its edges were uneven, as if it had been carved hastily, and the handle was cold, so cold it burned. The door opened into a room that shouldn't have existed. It was small and claustrophobic, the air stale and suffocating. Shelves lined the walls, covered in a thick layer of dust, and on them were objects that didn't seem to belong together. A child's porcelain shoe, its laces frayed and yellowed with age. A rusted key that looked like it might crumble if touched. An ancient doll, its face cracked and one glass eye missing. Each item felt wrong, as though they had been taken from lives cut short and left here to rot. The whispers swirled around me, growing louder, more insistent. They weren't just in the air anymore. They were in my head, pressing against the inside of my skull. They weren't just voices, they were emotions, grief, rage, fear, all crashing into me at once. And then the shadows moved. At first it was subtle, just a flicker in the corner of my vision. But as the whispers grew, the shadows began to stretch and shift, their edges too sharp, their movements too deliberate. They weren't reacting to the light, they were reacting to me. One shadow broke away from the others, coalescing into a form that was almost human, but not quite. Its edges flickered and warped, and where its face should have been was only darkness. But it had eyes, two burning red orbs that stared at me with a hunger that made my chest tighten. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The whispers turned into words then clear and cold. You shouldn't be here. The shadow figure took a step forward, and the air around me seemed to collapse, pressing against my lungs, my skin, my thoughts. I stumbled backward, my hand knocking against one of the shelves. The child's shoe fell to the floor with a dull thud, and the figure stopped, its head tilting as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, the whispers chasing me down the corridor, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of anger and despair. The house seemed to twist around me, its hallways stretching and shifting, doors appearing and disappearing. I had no idea where I was or how to get back to the group. Finally, I found myself in another room, larger this time, its walls covered in symbols I recognized from the journal. They pulsed faintly, their glow rhythmic, almost alive. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it rested a book. Its cover was cracked and worn, but the symbols etched into it glowed with the same faint light as the walls. I stepped closer, drawn to it despite the fear clawing at my mind. The whispers were deafening now, but they weren't random. They were chanting, repeating the same phrase over and over. I didn't understand the words, but I felt their weight, their urgency. The journal had mentioned a seal, something that bound the house's power. Was this it? Was this book the key to everything? I reached out, my fingers brushing the surface, and the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. It was heavy, oppressive, a void that pressed against my ears and my chest. And then the book moved. Its cover shifted, the symbols writhing like living things, and the room grew colder. The shadows gathered around me, and from them the figure emerged again, taller and more defined this time. Its presence was overwhelming, a crushing weight that drove me to my knees. "You cannot undo what has been done," it said, its voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The symbols on the book flared brighter, their light cutting through the darkness, and for a moment, the figure hesitated. I took my chance and ran, clutching the journal to my chest as I fled. The hallways twisted around me, the house roaring in protest, but somehow I found my way back to the entrance. I stumbled out into the night, gasping for air, the whispers still faint in the back of my mind. The house loomed behind me, silent and still, but I knew better. It wasn't done with me. It had marked me, and I couldn't escape it. Back at home, the dreams grew worse. They weren't just dreams anymore. They were memories that didn't belong to me. I saw Sarah Winchester, her hands trembling as she carved symbols into the walls, her voice shaking as she begged the spirits for forgiveness. I saw rooms filled with light and shadow, with things that shouldn't have existed. And I saw the book, always the book, its symbols glowing, its pages turning on their own. The journal offered fragments of explanation, but no solace. It spoke of a living book, a seal that bound something ancient and terrible within the house. It hinted at rituals, sacrifices, and a darkness that couldn't be contained forever. I knew I should walk away, but I couldn't. The house had chosen me, and I needed to know why. I needed to understand what it wanted, even if it meant going back, even if it meant facing whatever waited for me in the shadows. I didn't choose to go back to the Winchester House. It was as if the house had decided for me. The whispers, the dreams, the bruises, they all led me to that moment, standing at the gates once again, staring at its dark silhouette against the night sky. I told myself it was for answers, but deep down, I knew it was something more. The house had claimed me, and I couldn't resist its pull. This time, I didn't follow the tour group. I slipped away as soon as I stepped inside, moving through the familiar hallways with an unsettling certainty. The house guided me, its whispers forming a trail I couldn't help but follow. The corridors stretched longer, the walls pressed closer, and the air grew colder with every step. The shadows weren't just passive observers anymore. They shifted and swayed, leading me deeper into the maze. At the end of a long, twisting hallway, I found it. A hidden door. Its edges glowing faintly as though the house itself wanted me to notice it. The handle was warm under my hand, pulsing faintly, almost like a heartbeat. I hesitated, but the whispers urged me on. When I opened the door, the air rushed out like a sigh, and I stepped into a vast underground chamber. The room was unlike anything I had seen in the house before. The walls were covered in glowing symbols, their patterns intricate and almost hypnotic. They pulsed in rhythm with the air itself, as if the room were alive. In the center stood a pedestal, smooth and black, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen. Resting on it was a book. The book wasn't like any book I had ever seen. Its cover was cracked and weathered, but the symbols etched into it moved, shifting and writhing like living things. As I stepped closer, I realized the book wasn't just sitting there. It was breathing. The faint rise and fall of its surface was unmistakable, and with every movement, I felt a vibration in the air, low and steady, like the beat of a heart. The whispers grew louder, a chaotic symphony of voices that filled the chamber. They weren't just noise anymore. They were words, fragmented and overlapping. They spoke of a seal, of a prison, of something bound and waiting. The book was the key, the whispers said. But they didn't agree on what it unlocked. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and touched the book. The moment my fingers brushed its surface, the world shattered. I was no longer in the chamber. I was everywhere and nowhere, the house's history unfolding before me in vivid, nightmarish detail. I saw Sarah Winchester, her hands trembling as she carved symbols into the walls, her voice shaking as she begged unseen forces for forgiveness. I saw the workers building endless corridors and staircases that led to nothing, their faces blank and their movements mechanical. I saw rooms filled with shadows that moved on their own, shapes twisting and contorting in ways that defied logic. And I saw the victims. People drawn to the house like moths to a flame, their faces etched with fear as the walls closed in around them. Their screams echoed through the corridors, but no one came to help. They were devoured, their essence absorbed into the house, feeding its insatiable hunger. The visions ended as abruptly as they began, and I was back in the chamber, gasping for air. The book's surface was glowing now, its symbols blazing with an intensity that hurt to look at. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against my ears. Then, the shadow figure emerged. It stepped out from the walls, its form more defined than before. It was tall and jagged, its edges flickering like a flame caught in the wind. Where its face should have been was only darkness, but its eyes burned with a crimson light that pierced through the gloom. It spoke for the first time, its voice a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "You should not have come here," it said. "You cannot undo what has been done." The air around me grew heavier, the walls bending and shifting as though the house was reacting to the entity's presence. Objects began to levitate, the symbols on the walls glowing brighter and pulsing faster. The book vibrated under my hand, its rhythm matching the pounding of my heart. The figure took a step closer, and the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in the air, and my body felt like it was being crushed under an invisible weight. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and desperation. "Leave," the figure said, its voice shaking the chamber. "Leave or be consumed." But I couldn't leave. Not yet. The book's glow was brighter now, almost blinding, and I could feel its power pulsing through me. It wasn't just a book. It was alive, and it was angry. I picked it up, and the moment I did, the entity recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. The walls began to shake, the ground beneath me trembling as cracks spread through the chamber. The symbols on the walls burned red, their light casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed like living things. The whispers had turned into screams, a deafening roar that drowned out all other sound. I ran. The entity gave chase, its movements swift and jagged, its form stretching and twisting in impossible ways. The house's layout shifted around me, hallways collapsing and reappearing, doors leading to nowhere. The air was filled with the sound of cracking wood and shattering glass, the house itself seeming to fight against me. I stumbled through corridor after corridor, the entity always just behind me. Its presence was overwhelming, a suffocating weight that made every step feel like a struggle. I could hear its growls, low and guttural, and feel the heat of its burning eyes on my back. Finally, I burst through a door and found myself back in the main hall. The house was quieter now, but the silence was wrong. It wasn't peace, it was the calm before a storm. I could feel the book's weight in my hands, its surface still warm and pulsing faintly. I knew I had escaped for now, but the house had left its mark on me. When I looked down at my arm, I saw them. The symbols from the book burned into my skin. They glowed faintly, their lines intricate and impossible. The whispers were still there, quieter now but persistent, a reminder that the house wasn't done with me. As I stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a wave, and I realized I had been holding my breath. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I knew better. It was watching, waiting for me to return. And deep down, I knew I would. The book was a part of me now, its power coursing through my veins. The house had claimed me, and there was no escaping it. Not really. The whispers told me so, their voices a constant reminder of what I had seen, what I had done, and what was still to come. The book sat on the table in my apartment, its surface faintly glowing in the dim light. I had spent days staring at it, the whispers gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, urging me to act. I told myself I could destroy it, that I could end whatever it was the Winchester House had started. But deep down, I wasn't sure. The book wasn't just an object, it was alive, and it was powerful. Destroying it might stop the whispers, but what if it unleashed something worse? Still, I couldn't live like this. The bruises on my arms had become darker, more defined, and I could feel the house's influence growing stronger with each passing day. The shadows in my apartment moved when they shouldn't, their shapes stretching unnaturally across the walls. And the whispers, they weren't just voices anymore. They were thoughts, not my own, but intrusive, invasive, filling my mind with images of the house, the book, and the entity that watched me from the darkness. I knew I had to go back. The house wouldn't let me escape, not while the book still existed. So I packed a bag with whatever I thought I might need, though I didn't know what could possibly help. And I drove through the fog-choked streets to the Winchester House. The house loomed larger than I remembered, its jagged roof lines cutting through the night sky. The air was thick and cold, and the gate creaked as I pushed it open. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the dark windows, half expecting to see something staring back. But there was nothing, just silence. I stepped inside, and the house came alive. The air shifted, growing heavier, and the whispers surged around me, louder and more insistent than ever. The walls seemed closer, the corridors darker. The house wasn't just watching me, it was waiting. I made my way to the chamber, following the path I had taken before. The house twisted and shifted around me, but the whispers guided me, pulling me deeper into its labyrinth. When I reached the chamber, the symbols on the walls were brighter than ever, their light casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed like living things. The book sat on the pedestal, its surface pulsing faintly, its power palpable. I approached it cautiously, my hands trembling. The whispers filled my ears, a cacophony of voices urging me to act. Some begged me to destroy the book, others warned me to leave it alone. And then the shadow figure appeared. It stepped out of the walls, its form more solid than before, its jagged edges flickering like a flame. Its eyes burned with a crimson light, and its presence filled the room, a suffocating weight that pressed down on me from all sides. "You cannot destroy it," it said, its voice a low, guttural rumble. "The book is the source. It binds the house, contains its power. To destroy it is to release what cannot be controlled." I hesitated, the weight of its words sinking in. If the book was the source of the house's power, destroying it might end the whispers, the shadows, the torment. But what if the entity was right? What if destroying the book unleashed something far worse? The figure stepped closer, its eyes narrowing. "You do not understand what you hold. The house was built to contain, to protect. The book is the seal, and the seal must remain unbroken." I stared at the book, its surface glowing faintly, its symbols writhing like living things. The whispers were louder now, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear and desperation. They didn't agree. Some wanted the book destroyed, others wanted it preserved. And I was caught in the middle, unsure of what to do. "It lies," one voice said, clear and sharp amid the chaos. "The book is not a seal, it is a prison. Destroy it and you free what is trapped inside." "Do not listen," another voice countered. "The house is a prison, not a sanctuary. The book binds its power. To destroy it is to destroy yourself." The entity roared, its form flickering violently, and the room began to shake. The walls bent and twisted, the symbols glowing brighter and pulsing faster. Objects levitated, spinning wildly in the air before crashing to the ground. The house was retaliating, fighting against me, against the decision I was about to make. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The whispers were deafening, the entity's presence overwhelming. But I knew I had to choose. I reached out and grabbed the book, its surface warm and alive under my hands. The entity lunged at me, its form stretching and twisting, but I held my ground. "You do not understand what you are doing," it said, its voice shaking the room. "If you open it, there is no going back." But I had already made my choice. I opened the book. The moment the cover lifted, the room erupted in light. It was blinding, a searing white that burned into my vision, and the air filled with a deafening hum that vibrated through my entire body. The walls began to collapse, the symbols shattering like glass, their pieces dissolving into nothingness. The entity screamed, its voice a deep, guttural roar that shook the foundations of the house. I saw them then, the spirits trapped within the house. They surged out of the book, their forms twisting and writhing as they filled the chamber. They weren't free, they were furious, their anger directed at me, at the house, at everything that had kept them imprisoned for so long. The house was falling apart, its walls crumbling, its corridors collapsing into darkness. I ran, clutching the book to my chest as the ground shifted beneath me. The entity pursued me, its form flickering and unstable, its growls echoing through the chaos. "You cannot escape," it said, its voice a command, a promise. "This is not the end." I didn't look back. The house roared around me, its fury palpable, its power surging as it tried to stop me. Doors appeared and disappeared, hallways stretched and twisted, but somehow I found my way to the entrance. I burst through the front door and into the night, the cold air hitting me like a wave. Behind me, the house collapsed in on itself, its walls folding inward, its windows shattering. The ground trembled as the structure imploded, leaving nothing but a dark, gaping void where it had once stood. But even as I watched, I knew it wasn't over. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, a reminder of what I had done. I looked down at my hands and I saw them. The symbols from the book burned into my skin. They glowed faintly, their lines intricate and impossible. The book was gone, but its mark remained, a part of me now, inescapable. The entity's voice echoed in my mind, low and menacing. "This is not the end. You cannot destroy what you do not understand." I drove away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, the whispers growing louder with every mile. I knew I hadn't escaped. The house was gone, but its power had followed me. lingering in the symbols on my skin, in the whispers in my mind. It wasn't just a part of me, it was me. And I knew without a doubt that this wasn't over. The house had been destroyed, but its essence lived on. It had marked me, claimed me, and it would never let me go. The whispers promised that much. I thought destroying the house would set me free. I thought the whispers would stop, that the shadows would leave, that I could go back to my life. But the house isn't a place, it's a presence, and it doesn't let go. In the weeks after, I tried to convince myself that it was over. The house was gone, reduced to rubble and ash, nothing more than a memory. But the marks on my skin told a different story. The symbols burned into my arms glowed faintly in the dark, their lines shifting and writhing as if alive. I tried to hide them, to cover them with long sleeves, but I could still feel their warmth, their pulse. The house wasn't just a memory, it had followed me. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The twisting corridors, the shifting walls, the shadow figure with its burning eyes. The dreams weren't just dreams, they were memories, visions of the house's victims, of the spirits trapped within its walls. They whispered to me, begged me to help them, cursed me for what I had done. And when I woke, the whispers didn't stop. They were quieter, yes, but they were always there, lurking at the edges of my thoughts. I tried to pretend I was fine. I went back to work, tried to reconnect with friends, but I wasn't the same. I'd forget what I was saying mid-sentence, lose track of time, stare blankly at my computer screen for hours. People noticed. They asked if I was okay, but what could I tell them? That I was haunted by a house that no longer existed. That shadows moved in my apartment when they shouldn't. That I could hear whispers in the silence. They would have called me crazy. Maybe I was. It wasn't just the whispers or the dreams. It was the shadows. They followed me everywhere, stretching impossibly long, shifting when there was no light to move them. I'd catch glimpses of shapes in the corner of my eye, figures that vanished when I turned to look. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the bruises returned, faint fingerprints appearing on my arms and neck. I wasn't imagining anything. The house had marked me, and it wasn't letting go. I started avoiding people, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. The whispers grew louder when I was around others, mocking me, taunting me. The shadows grew bolder, reaching for the people I cared about. I was terrified of what might happen if they got too close, so I pushed everyone away. It was easier that way, safer. I spent my days researching, trying to understand what had happened, what I had unleashed. The journal was gone, destroyed with the house, but the knowledge it held had burned itself into my mind. The book wasn't a seal, it was a prison. And when I opened it, I didn't just destroy the house, I set something free. The entity's voice still echoes in my mind. This is not the end. You cannot destroy what you do not understand. I didn't understand then, and I still don't. But I know it's not over. The house might be gone, but its essence remains, and it's growing stronger. The whispers are proof of that. They're not just in my head anymore. Sometimes I hear them outside, faint and distant, carried on the wind. The shadows, too, are spreading, their edges creeping across my walls, my floors, my mind. I don't know how much longer I can fight it. The house has taken so much from me already. My sleep, my sanity, my life. But it wants more. I can feel it pulling at me, drawing me back. The marks on my arms burn when I resist, their glow growing brighter, hotter, as if the house is reminding me who I belong to. If you're listening to this, you might be wondering why I'm telling you all of this. Why I didn't just keep it to myself, bury it with the rest of my life. The truth is, I don't know. Maybe it's a warning, or maybe it's a confession. Either way, you need to understand, the house isn't gone, it's waiting, and it's always hungry. You might think you're safe, that you're just listening to a story, but that's how it starts, that's how it started for me. A thread on a forum, a cryptic journal, a single question. What if a house wasn't just a house? Curiosity is a sharp blade, and once it cuts you, there's no going back. Maybe you've already felt it. The pull, the whispers, the shadows that move when they shouldn't. If you have, then it's already too late. The house has noticed you. It's patient. It doesn't need to rush. It will wait until you're ready, until you're desperate enough to seek it out. And when you do, it will take everything. If you haven't felt it, then consider yourself lucky. But don't get comfortable. The house is always watching, always waiting for its next victim. It doesn't matter who you are, where you are, or how careful you think you've been. Once it notices you, it's only a matter of time. I don't know how my story ends. The whispers are louder now, constant, and the shadows are closing in. The marks on my skin burn brighter with each passing day, their glow a constant reminder of what I've done. I can feel the house's pull, stronger than ever, and I know it's only a matter of time before I go back. Not because I want to, but because I have to. The house doesn't give you a choice. So please, if you've heard the whispers, if you've seen the shadows, if you've felt the pull, walk away. Don't let your curiosity lead you down the same path I took, because once the house notices you, it's already too late. This isn't just my story, it's yours too. The house is waiting, and it's always hungry.